So this was a great lead-in to our next session, which is AI in computational imaging, which is most of our conference. And the first talk is an invited talk by Grace Cole from Meta. So thanks a lot.
Thanks for having me. My name is Grace. I'm a researcher in the Display Systems Research Group at Meta. We've had a lot of great talks this morning already, and most of them are focusing on imaging systems. So this is the Computational Imaging Conference, but I'm going to turn this a little around and talk about computational displays instead. So my work focuses on a wide variety of displays, specifically for head-mounted systems like AR and VR displays. And today I'm going to be talking about a subset of my work on holographic displays. So this is an example of a hologram. I took this clip from a 3 Blue 1 Brown video. This is an analog hologram of a microscope where we have this thin sheet that contains this beautiful 3D image, really 4D. We've got parallax cues, view-dependent effects, defocus cues, and all of it is contained in this thin 2D sheet. So how does something like this work? Well, we start with a real object, like our microscope here, and we're going to illuminate it with light from a laser. That light bounces off of the object, it interferes with itself, it fills the space. But everywhere, even with this complicated light pattern, everywhere we can characterize the electric field by an amplitude and a phase. So let's say we have some plane in front of our object, and we can record and measure the amplitude and phase at every point along this plane. Then when we illuminate this plane with light, we're going to impart that amplitude and phase onto that incoming light, so that on the right side of this plane, we get the same field as though the object were really present, even if the object isn't there. And that means when we look at this sheet, we're going to see the same field as though the object were present, and so that's going to be complete with all of the effects that we see in real life. So in reality, we need the amplitude and phase here, and phase is very hard to measure. So what we do is we shine in what we call a reference beam, and that light is coherent with the light on the object, and so this is going to create complex interference patterns, or very complex high-frequency fringes. And we'll put a photosensitive material on top of those fringes, and that will record this intensity pattern that allows us to translate the phase information into this actual material. Now we have this complex pattern, and it turns out that if we re-illuminate this with our reference beam, the light's going to diffract off of these fringes, creating the pattern as though the object were really there. And this is how we end up with this beautiful sort of holographic display where all of these effects are captured in this thin film. So what is it that I'm doing? This has been done a long time ago. My goal is to take this technology and turn it into a real display. This is basically a photograph. It's something that's static and can't change over time, and it had to be printed from an actual object. We'd like to have this be a display where we can change the content dynamically, and we can use computer-generated content without having to physically instantiate the thing that we're going to display. So this is the area of computer-generated holography. And in order to make this a dynamic display from this analog system, we have to make a few changes. The first is we're going to replace this static film with some dynamic modulator that we can control. And the second is we're going to replace the physical interference of these light paths with a computational simulation. Now, unfortunately, both of these changes are pretty fraught. On the simulation side, we've got really good ways of simulating how light propagates and interacts with itself, but it's really hard to accurately model everything that's happening in the real world. These holograms are based on interference effects, and so we really have to get things very precisely correct in order for our simulation to match what we eventually show on our actual display. One of the things that is very prone to having errors in real life are these spatial light modulators themselves. There are a lot of differences between this and the ideal films that we had in the analog situation. Most notably, the features that we want to capture here are on the order of the wavelength of light. So that's a few hundred nanometers. But the smallest pixels that we can get on modulators today are a handful of microns, so about an order of magnitude off from what we'd like. In addition, this is all happening on a single plane, as where in the film, even though the film is thin by like regular people standards, it's many wavelengths thick, so we can capture volumetric effects in that situation, but not with these thin modulators. And then finally, these modulators rarely act ideally. You might have limited bit depth. You might have crosstalk between pixels, so the pixels don't act independently from each other. And all of these contribute to the imperfections of these devices. So it's really all of these effects that make computer-generated holography such a compelling area of research, because we're trying to overcome all of these limitations to make a compelling display. There's a lot of work that I've been doing in this field and a lot of academic papers on this work. Felix has a lot of work on this as well. But this is a short talk, so I'm only going to go into a deep dive in one project and one of the challenges that come up from these systems. And actually, the challenge that I want to talk about isn't due to any of these imperfections. It's really fundamental to the nature of holographic displays. And that is that all of this depends on coherent illumination. The whole premise of holograms starts with laser illumination. And say that we had an ideal modulator with infinite resolution and infinite extent, and we had a perfect simulation. All we can do in this case is we can try to create a replica of reality, but that's a replica of reality under laser illumination, not under the everyday incoherent illumination that we generally see around us. And so if you've had a chance to play with a laser, you probably know that lasers lead to a lot of differences between what we see with lasers and what we see in regular life. So to illustrate that, here's a picture of an optics lab. Many of you have hopefully had a chance to play around in a laser lab. If you haven't, I think it's really fun. That is, if you're an introvert and you like dark basement rooms. So this is just a random picture I took with my cell phone. And if you take a close-up look at the optics, you can see this grainy pattern. And this is speckle from the laser. Speckle is a really fundamental problem in holographic displays, because it's the coherent nature of the light that both causes the speckle and is what allows us to form the image content as well. So we can't remove the coherence, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to make our hologram. The speckle happens because when we shine laser light on our object and it hits some diffuse surface, the light's going to scatter off in a bunch of different directions, and then the light's going to come together to form a point on your retina or on your camera sensor. And by chance, some of these light rays are going to constructively interfere, creating bright spots. But by chance, there's going to be different path length differences, and just small distances away, you're going to get destructive interference that create the dark spots. The result is this very characteristic grainy pattern that we call speckle. Now, in our holographic displays, we generally don't want to see this speckle. It's really noisy, it disrupts the image, it doesn't look good. So what we generally do is we're going to try to optimize this microsurface on the object. We can set this up as a phase retrieval problem, where essentially we're saying we can't see the phase or this surface directly, we only see the macro statistics, but maybe we can optimize exactly what's happening to try to make the speckle as unnoticeable as possible. This works really well in simulation, especially if we're just simulating a simple 2D image. So this is an example where I set this up as a phase retrieval problem. We can try to make an image of this house. You don't see any speckle in it. It looks great. Basically, what we're doing is we're trying to line up all of those speckle grains so that they're unnoticeable. But as you can imagine, this is very not robust. And so even in simulation, if we simulate just a small eye movement, we're going to have all that speckle return, because now those path lengths no longer are lined up exactly as we wanted. This is even more prevalent when we try to simulate 3D or 4D scenes. And so this is an example in an ideal simulation. We're trying to create a 3D volume of light. So here the virtual camera is focused on the foreground, now the middle, and now the background. And this speckle is prevalent even though this is a completely ideal simulation. And that's simply because we don't have enough degrees of freedom on our two-dimensional modulator to control the speckle over this full 3D volume. So let's take a moment and pause. You're probably wondering, why is this speckle such a problem in these computer-generated holograms, but maybe not in these analog holograms? And the short answer is that speckle is a problem in all holograms, including the analog ones, but it's a lot less noticeable. I found this very charmingly old-school looking holography forum where one of the users is trying to ask other users on how to solve speckle noise in their analog holograms. And what they say when they describe the speckle is that it is some very fine, hardly noticeable graininess that looks like tiny black holes. I assume this is speckle. So the thing to note here is they call it very fine and hardly noticeable, which are terms that we generally do not use to describe our computer-generated holograms. So if we look back at the differences between our analog and computer-generated holograms, the main culprit here is the low resolution of our modulators, because we've got about an order of magnitude larger pixels than we do equivalently in our analog holograms. And so the speckle tends to be about an order of magnitude larger, making it much more visually salient. In addition, because this is an interference effect, small amounts of model mismatch in our simulation or small imperfections in our modulator can also make the speckle much more prominent. And we only have this 2D surface where we can modulate light, so we have fewer degrees of freedom that we can use to control the speckle. So what can we do about this? We can look back at our forum to see if anyone has any ideas. But unfortunately, this user says, from what I recall, this is a fundamental problem that has no solution. Which honestly, I kind of agree with on some level. Really what we're trying to do is to mitigate how much this speckle hurts us. We're trying to reduce the speckle contrast as much as possible so that it's less noticeable. Maybe we're trying to reduce the speckle size. But we're not going to get rid of it entirely as long as we have this high degree of coherence in our systems. So how do we mitigate speckle? The most common and pretty simple way to do this is through what's called temporal multiplexing, which is just what it sounds like. We're going to show a bunch of instantiations of different speckle over time. And then if we show them fast enough due to your persistence of vision, they're going to get averaged together by your eye, and so the speckle contrast gets reduced. This is super effective. This is what it looks like in simulation. So here we have background, middle, foreground. And you get these nice defocus blur and greatly reduced speckle. But the problem with temporal multiplexing is that we always want more. The speckle is never quite not quite as gone as you want it. We also want to save our temporal bandwidth for other uses. So once again, short talk. But there are a lot of problems with holographic displays. One of them is field of view. And if we have extra temporal bandwidth, we can start to scan out over different field of view. So we'd really like to save any temporal bandwidth we have for these scenarios. Also, as Mark mentioned, our speckle reduction is going to go with the square root of the number of frames. So we start to get diminishing returns if we want more speckle reduction than we can get. And we really run into a data bandwidth problem. We might have 1 million, 2 million, 4 million pixels on our modulator, and we'd like to run this in the kilohertz range, maybe even tens of kilohertz. So that starts to be a lot of data that we're trying to stream through for these systems. So I'd like to talk about a project that I worked on to address some of these issues and try to get despeckling that is as good as temporal multiplexing, but doing it in a single frame with significantly less data. So the concept of this is that rather than creating different instantiations of the speckle over time, we're going to do it over space. So let's say that we have a few light sources at different positions. Each of these is going to illuminate our modulator from a different angle, and therefore that's going to create a different speckle pattern. If we turn all of these on simultaneously, those speckle patterns are going to average. But this isn't quite so simple, because if we're showing an image on our modulator, then when we illuminate from a different angle, that light sees the same pattern on the modulator, but geometrically, the object is going to land in a different position spatially. You can probably see where this is going. If we turn on all of these at once, we're going to get a bunch of blurring and doubling. And even if we know exactly what's going to happen and we try to optimize our pattern knowing that, it's a really poorly posed problem, and so we can't get good image quality. So the problem here is that our modulator effectively has infinite memory effect. It doesn't have any angular selectivity, and so each of these different light sources is seeing the same pattern on the modulator. Our idea for this project was basically taking a leaf out of the book from the analog holograms, which have these volumetric films. And so rather than having a single modulator here, we proposed adding a second modulator with a small air gap between them. So now each of these light sources is effectively going to see a different relative translation between these two SLMs. And so then they each get effectively their own pattern. This allows us to show the same image content at sort of the same position in real space, but different positions relative to where the beam is for each of these different light sources. And so now each of these versions of this dragon are in the same location, but have different speckle patterns. And we can turn on the light simultaneously in order to get our clean image. To do this, we're basically just going to set up an optimization problem to optimize the content for these two SLMs simultaneously to enable these sort of relative shifts to work out. So this works quite well. Here's our simulation. It looks pretty similar to our temporal multiplexing case, but all of this is done in a single time frame, and we have just like sort of 2 modulators worth of data as opposed to 8+ frames of temporal multiplexing. So this is what our prototype of this looked like. We used a bunch of fibers held together in a 3D printed housing to create this multi-source configuration. And we set it up in a nice benchtop setup that allowed us to toggle between this multiple source configuration and the more traditional single source. So when we try to create a 2D image, theoretically, we could control all the speckle perfectly, but in real life, that never happens. There's always some speckle in the image. I do have theories about why that happens, but I won't get into that. So this is sort of our best calibration that we're able to get with the traditional single source. And then with our multi-source system, we can remove a lot of the speckle. Here's another example with my co-author Florian's cats. And really where this starts to shine is when we move into volumetric visualization. And this is really one of our goals with holographic displays, is to go beyond just creating something that we could show on a regular monitor. So here, this is a real experimental holographic display, but I'm capturing it with a camera. And so right now, the camera is focused on the background, and now the middle, and now the foreground. And here, the speckle really corrupts the image a lot because it's much harder to control on the 3D volume. So this is with our multi-source system, which greatly improves the speckle and the contrast as well, while preserving these nice focal cues. In this example, you can barely see the focus shift as you shift around through the focus stack, but it's much clearer with our multi-source system. So this was all done on this nice benchtop setup, makes it really easy to prototype and try to explore these concepts quickly. But we envision trying to take these ideas beyond something that we just do for our first proof of concept and move them into something that could be compact. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm particularly focused on head-mounted displays, so sort of VR-like settings. And so for this project, I imagine adapting this sort of VR architecture that could be used for a holographic display, which starts with using a waveguide to illuminate a reflective SLM. Light bounces off that SLM, passes through a thin diffractive lens to make a nice VR holographic display. And there is a paper in 2022 talking about this architecture. Now, to turn this into something that we can use this multi-source system on, we need to have different illumination that hits the SLM at different angles. But luckily, that's exactly how waveguides work. If we replace our single source input with multiple sources, each of these is going to outcouple from the waveguide at a different angle. And this can happen simultaneously in the system. Now, we also need a second SLM with an air gap between them. But this works out pretty nicely, because we could imagine putting a transmissive amplitude SLM on the other side of the waveguide. So the waveguide naturally creates a gap without adding a huge amount more thickness to the system. So this isn't something that we've actually built yet. There are still a lot of challenges and things to address, like the reduced fill factor that you usually get in transmissive SLMs. But I think that this goes to show that these systems could translate from things that we can do on benchtops into more compact and form factor friendly applications. So there's still a long way to go from our computer generated holograms that we have right now into this ultimate vision of taking the analog holograms and making them something that is dynamic. But I hope that this gives you a sense of some of the work that we're starting to do to chip away at this problem and get towards what could be the ultimate display. Thank you.
All right, questions?
My apologies if I missed this in your talk, but how are you achieving the colored look to the holograms? I'm used to them being monochromatic.
Yeah, so For the computer-generated holograms, the main way that we do that is temporally, which is another reason why we don't want to use up all our temporal bandwidth on speckle reduction. So we basically do field sequential color, so we'll show each color in rapid succession.
Can you comment on the noise statistics in your multi-source images? Do you know anything about them?
So it's not a simple averaging. So first of all, the speckle noise is not like exactly like a white noise statistic. And then in the multi-source system, because all of these different, like the different images that get averaged together aren't purely independent from each other because we're still starting with two modulators, it's not like as clean as just averaging those together. So I guess the short answer is no, I don't really know what the statistics are, but that could definitely be something, like we studied in the paper sort of scaling effects as we increase the number of sources and as we change different parameters, but we don't have a very strong like mathematical underpinning of what the statistics are.
Can we get our next speaker to set up while we ask the last question?
Yeah, of course.
To clarify, in your multi-source holography, I'm over here on the right. Yeah, in the multi-source holography results, do you use any multiplexing at all? And another follow-up question, like I tend to think that using multiple lasers is kind of a lesser hack. Maybe, I mean, like, have you ever considered using fully incoherent like LED light sources? Yeah, your opinion on that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's the temporal multiplexing is just to do the color for the multi-source system. So it is like to show the color images, it's basically 3 frames. And then the second part of the question is, can you use fully incoherent sources or not use lasers at all? And the challenge there is you basically get a trade-off between resolution and speckle because it is the coherence of the system, it's the diffraction off of the SLM and the self-interference that creates the image content in the first place. So if you use a less coherent source, you basically just blur everything. And so there's definitely some situations where that could be the right choice. But if we want to maintain the resolution of the system, like temporal multiplexing, you don't throw away resolution. And with a multi-source system, as long as you choose your sources correctly, then you also don't throw away resolution either. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, let's thank Grace again. Our next talk is also invited talk by Michael Mueller from University Siegen. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation and the opportunity to present here today. I'm actually giving this talk, Learning to Sense, on behalf of an entire team or research unit conducting research behind the 3 projects I will give an overview of. And in general, our goal is to move away from the separate design where usually a colleague from electrical engineering designs a sensor system and only after the sensor system has been built and starts recording data, the data is kind of given to us, as I work in machine learning and computer science, to then develop network architectures that try to analyze the recorded data, and instead take a joint optimization approach in which we pick a particular application and try to optimize both the machine learning as well as the sensor system setup along different degrees of freedom jointly. So on a little more technical note, in machine learning, we're still trying to cleverly guess parametric functions. We're still calling them neural networks. They depend on learnable parameters called theta here, as well as some input data. We are still collecting training data in the sense of pairs of input data and desired ground truth, still comparing them with the loss function, averaging all training examples and minimizing for the best parameters. But now we say, let's stop considering the input data to be something fixed and rather say that the input data should be a function of stuff we cannot influence, being called the scene parameters zeta I here, so properties of the objects in the scene, as well as the design parameters we can steer, being called nu here, and try to treat them exactly like parameters of the neural network, so jointly optimize for network parameters as well as design parameters in a suitable design space. And I would now like to give you an overview of 3 different projects we have realized in this context. The first one being on learned resolution patterns, because if we look at specific applications here, for instance, autonomous driving, it seems a little odd that we're trying to record these scenes with equally spaced and equally sized pixels, because usually with the camera mounted on top of a car, the bottom center here should show street. The top center is maybe less interesting and definitely less diverse in terms of semantic labels, which are shown here. And therefore, we parameterized different ways how we could arrange the layouts here with two very simple kinds of parameters, and then set up a simulation pipeline. So this X of new that I showed on the previous formula, starting with a high resolution image, simulating the new sensor layout, which, okay, I have different ways how to display. So if I'm still displaying every pixel that I record here as an equally sized, equally spaced pixel on my display, the bird gets very fat. And then I'm taking my favorite neural network, making, say, a semantic segmentation prediction on this, comparing it to the ground truth, and then not only optimize for network parameters here, but also in a differentiable way for the resolution parameters here. And we were happy to demonstrate that quantitatively as well as qualitatively we can gain performance advantages here, specifically at low resolutions, and the typical learned layout reflects what you would think it reflects. So it's important to get fine details vertically in the middle and horizontally towards the sides. And we were, for instance, able to resolve some challenging cases, like a person standing here barely visible behind that truck. As another example, I would like to pick something along the imaging pipeline, namely the quantization. So most of our sensors use some physical effect to first generate an analog signal, which then gets digitalized in an ADC, so an analog to digital converter. And this comparison here in the ADC is typically done in a linear fashion. And we were wondering, specifically at low bit depth, does it make sense to choose the thresholds for the quantization differently? So we parameterized it in a specific way and optimized it in various different applications, again demonstrating that specifically at low bit depths you can get significant advantages in, for instance, here is even a non-imaging technique in human activity recognition from body-worn data, but we also demonstrated this on semantic segmentation again, or object detection in imaging cases. And now, while this is maybe still somewhat standard or straightforward, I'm very excited to now move towards temporally changing quantizations. So the idea to consider videos, consider the most extreme form of quantization down to a single bit, but then vary the threshold that you need then for the single bit at every frame, creating a somewhat strange looking sequence of binary images here, then feed these images into a network, condition them on the thresholds you have used in order to reconstruct the scene, at least at first reconstruct the scene. And this is very interesting because the ADC is responsible for quite a bit of the power consumption, and screenshotting out of the talk from Payman Milan Far this morning, moving data around often costs more time and battery than the actual computation. So there are many applications that could possibly benefit from one-bit imaging, specifically because this would allow us to drastically increase the frame rate to get the data away from the sensor fast in 1 bit. And next, I would like to show you a video of how this reconstruction looks like. Keep in mind that the thresholds have to be strongly varying, so we actually maximize a certain measure of total variation to get most informative frames in 1 bit in order to then feed them into a transformer-based architecture for the reconstruction. So this is how the input video then in 1 bit looks like. And next up is the reconstruction coming out of a network with 20 frame context always to reconstruct a frame. and this is the comparison to the ground truth. So I think this is surprisingly good and promising, specifically considering that you cannot do the usual alignment like an optical flow estimation on 1-bit images anymore faithfully. And we're now moving forward to using these 1-bit frames directly for semantic prediction, so not even trying to reconstruct anymore, giving rise to possibly object detections that in the future at a very fast pace could look like this. And occasionally you see a frame, I think, where you can recognize that it actually tracks the object that is indeed of interest. The third aspect I would like to talk about is learned illuminations, which we have focused on in the setting of a specific computational imaging task, namely Fourier pyrography microscopy, where the idea is to get a high resolution and at the same time wide field of view image by varying the illumination angle. We have heard a little about pyrography this morning already. So in the optical range, if you illuminate a probe centrally from the bottom, you get the usual kind of image at some fixed resolution, whereas if you illuminate strongly from the side, you don't get the central beam of light through your aperture anymore, but you're instead recording the scattering light. So you get so-called dark field images that look like this. And working out the physics, you can show that this basically corresponds to a crop in Fourier space. So you form a model where you record often hundreds of images that cover your entire Fourier space. So this is supposed to illustrate your Fourier space, and each circle here corresponds to one measurement that you're taking with this microscope. And then the usual approach is to phrase a minimization problem, as we have seen today already in the session on inverse problems. So just put in your physical model and minimize this, ideally with some additional regularizer, to reconstruct a wide field of view, high resolution image. Yet, in Fourier pyrography, these are often super expensive. So you have hundreds of images Fi, so this sum here contains 100 summons, and what you're interested in ultimately, this U here, is often a gigapixel image. So this reconstruction is computationally very expensive, and therefore we are considering to instead chop the wide field of view into smaller patches and try to first identify regions of interest and then only do the expensive computational reconstruction on this field of interest via a machine learning approach where the classifier doesn't need a reconstructed image but the raw stacked measurements. And for these raw stacked measurements, we are trying to learn the best multiplex illumination pattern in order for the subsequent classifier to succeed. Here, for instance, illustrated on identifying parasites in a thick blood smear, where each red tile here is a region of interest where we can find one of these parasites. And then the idea is to do the full reconstruction only for those patches where your network tells you that this is something to specifically look at. So our findings, doing some experiments on this, were that as we anticipated, just the central illumination, so the low resolution image, is often not enough to do this classification. So this basically shows classification accuracy in terms of F1 score versus different simulations of how good the SNR of the system is. And the blue curve here is just using the central LED, so this is not very good. Reconstructing is, for many systems, the best choice up until some noise level, where it's actually even better to feed the raw FPM stack measurements, so these many recordings directly into the network, because it can implicitly do some denoising before the classification, basically. And then the more promising or more exciting finding for us was that very few multiplexed captures, so here are actually enough to faithfully classify. So the black dotted line here is feeding all stacked measurements into the classifier versus the blue line, which is the learned illumination, multiplexing, and the x-axis here shows the number of captures we need. So as few as 4 measurements are typically enough to faithfully capture the objects of interest. This was, of course, all so far just simulation-based, but we are currently working towards also capturing this in real life, and we are quite excited that we have printed the famous MNIST handwritten dataset on a wafer. So here you see the 60,000 images of MNIST printed 6 times on this wafer. Such that we can actually put them under our microscope. Then each handwritten digit looks like this. So hopefully still not good enough to classify it faithfully, to then demonstrate that FPM and specifically our raw data fed into a classifier is able to identify certain digits. So we hope to release a data set on this soon. Look out. So to sum up, I think it's an exciting research direction to optimize sensor system design and neural network parameters jointly. And I've shown you that optimizing for resolution patterns in specific applications can give an advantage over uniformly sized and spaced pixels. The quantization optimization in analog to digital converters is a very exciting topic for us, specifically with videos and adaptive thresholds. And last but not least, the optimization of illumination in FPM might reduce the computational burden of a full reconstruction of the image that ultimately a human wants to investigate only in small areas. With this, I'm at the end of my talk. I would like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Could you talk about scenarios in optimizing sensor design when the design space might be like too large or like intractable or maybe not completely continuous? Like if we have different choices to make, like in that case, can we still use like this kind of end-to-end gradient descent approach or other techniques?
Yes, very good point. So there are many aspects to this that I didn't talk about. First, continuous and differentiable versus discrete. So we cannot make every simulation differentiable, and once it's non-differentiable, we have to turn to zero-order methods to optimize it. And if at the same time the design space is large, then yes, it's the usual caveat of zero-order optimization. You try to explore the space, but if you have no good prior of where good designs are, it's computationally expensive.
Thanks for the great talk. Something I was wondering about, you showed all of these different tasks we can study, and you said you can choose our favorite neural network for it. Have you found that there is any dependence on the power of the neural network? If, for example, we were doing these classification driving tasks and you wanted to use very small models, do the designs change significantly according to the models?
Ooh, that is a good point we have not investigated systematically enough for me to answer. In general, my observation is if you want to demonstrate advantages of the learned sensor design, it's better to work with smaller models, because the more powerful the models are and the larger the corresponding data set is they have been trained on, the better they can cope with suboptimal data, so your margin shrinks, so to speak. Your advantage shrinks.
All right, thank you very much.
Perfect, thanks.
Next talk is from a contributed paper, Shuffle Flow, Scalable Posterior Inference for Bayesian Inverse Imaging.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Tian Ao. I'm a PhD student from Northwestern, and today I'm very excited to tell you about our work, Shuffle Flow, Scalable Posterior Inference for Bayesian Inverse Imaging. We're interested in these inverse problems where an object of interest is being imaged through a known form model and into these partial and noisy measurements, and an inverse problem will be solved to reconstruct an image of these objects. And here I'm using an example of strong gravitational lens reconstruction and the Rubin telescope from the LSST Sky Survey, which just started 2 weeks ago. And in these scientific applications where usually the posterior on your image is required for downstream science, and especially with LSST, which will produce about 20 terabytes of raw data per night, what you really want to do is to have these posterior estimation at scale. And to estimate the posterior distribution, most of the method work by drawing samples from the Bayesian posterior. And a claim I want to make right here is that in these scientific applications, a lot of times you will want to have these high resolution posterior. And by high resolution posterior, I mean posterior distributions generated from a very large number of posterior samples. And here I'm showing an example of 3 pixel histograms from 3 different posterior distributions of the same inverse problem. So as you can see right here, the purple one, which is computed from 10K posterior samples, shows a very clear bimodal structure, while the blue and green one, which only has about 500 posterior samples, are much noisier, and it's much harder to tell that there's a bimodal posterior. So in these scientific applications, we want these high resolution posterior to tell us where these interesting science is happening. And to do this posterior sampling, there are mainly 2 types of methods. The first one is generative sampling, which we heard about this morning. These methods usually use diffusion models to learn priors and then sample by conditioning on your measurements. These methods typically need to run the full sampling loop for every posterior sample you want. So if you want to have a high resolution posterior, you typically need to run this for a lot of times. And on the other hand, variational inference, which trains these variational distributions, usually parameterized by some neural network at test time. And after training, you're able to easily draw samples from the learned distribution at very little cost. So here I'm showing the inference time of these 2 types of method as a function of the posterior sample count, the number of posterior samples you need. And here the blue and green line shows this linear trend. Those are like very representative diffusion samplers. So if you really want this high resolution posterior with a large sample count, you really need to do this. You really need a long inference time. And on the contrary, for variational inference, we have these horizontal curves, which means that most of the time will be dominated by the training, and after the training is done, you can easily draw samples from this. So in this work, we're interested in variational inference for its ability to very cheaply obtain these high resolution posteriors. And there's already been some work exploring on this topic. For example, in deep probabilistic imaging, or DPI, a normalizing flow network is used to parameterize and learn the posterior distribution. So these networks works by transforming a sample from a base distribution, usually a standard normal distribution, into a sample from your posterior by learning these invertible transforms. The problem with these normalizing flow networks, for example, real NVP used in this work, is that these networks scale very poorly with your image dimension. If you have an image of size n by n, your network size is O(n) to the power of 4. So this means if you want to model a large image, your network is going to be very expensive. So to mitigate this, some work decomposes the image into patches and uses smaller normalizing flow networks for individual patches, and then they will combine these patches back into the image, into a full resolution image. The problem with these work is that you need to train several normalizing flow networks simultaneously, and it's very challenging for these separate networks to model the global correlation across these patches. And also on one extreme, CFNeRF, which designs this probabilistic version of neural fields, uses these one-dimensional normalizing flow networks. So it works by flowing the individual pixels one by one through the normalizing flow network. So with this very strong sort of assumption, you're able to do this cheaply, but at the cost of constraining your posterior on a one-dimensional manifold, which we'll later show is going to hurt your posterior expressiveness. So to solve these challenges, our method leverages a novel problem decomposition where we decompose the problem of posterior inference into 3 components: a coordinate sampler, a feature encoder, and a posterior estimator. So for the coordinate sampler, in contrast to the aforementioned works, which either uses patching or pixelating strategies, we leverage the pixel unshuffling and shuffling transform, which are widely used in super resolution networks. So the advantage of these transforms is that first, they're invertible, which means they can be integrated nicely with normalizing float networks. And the way they work, these transforms work is by transforming your full resolution image into a sub-image stack, with each image in the image stack are a downsampled instance of your original image with a different downsampling coordinate offset. So in this case, you would generate an image stack with very similar structure, since they're all downsampled versions of the original image. And in this way, it will be much easier for a shared network to learn their joint distribution, and it's much easier to model the global correlation, since you keep these global structures in your downsampled instances. So our method works by first decomposing the image into a sub-image stack, and we will feed the downsampling coordinate offset for each image in this image stack into a neural field encoder, which will generate these embedding vectors. And then we'll use those embedding vectors to condition a much smaller normalizing float networks, because right now it operates on the scale of the downsampled sub-images. And then what this conditional normalizing flow network do is it's gonna take samples from our base distribution, which we also use a standard Gaussian distribution, and it will turn these into posterior samples, and we'll feed this posterior samples into a very standard KL divergence loss, which consists of a data likelihood term, a score prior term where we use a pre-trained score prior, and a negative entropy term, which enhances your sample diversity and prevents mode collapse during training. So after the training is done, you can very cheaply feed in those base samples into the conditional normalizing flow network, and you will get those posterior samples very cheaply. And before I show some real-world results, I want to mention this scalability analysis. So if you're modeling an image posterior for n by n images, and you're using a downsampling factor of S in your pixel unshuffling and shuffling transforms, for a conventional normalizing float network like in DPI, you would have a network size of n to the power of 4, while for our method, you would have a network size of n to the power of 4 divided by s to the power of 4 plus n squared. So the first term is coming from the normalizing flow network, and the second term is coming from the neural field encoder. And we empirically observed that if you pick a downsampling factor that is proportional to square root of n, you will get an overall network size of O(n) squared while preserving your posterior accuracy. However, we don't have like a good theoretical analysis on what is the optimal downsampling factor for the pixel and shuffling transform, and we will leave this to future work. So by leveraging this pixel shuffling and unshuffling transform, we observed that we're able to cut down the training costs by a lot in both training GPU memory and training time. So you can see here, the purple lines are hours, and you can see the huge gap, a huge decrease, especially towards the right of these plots where the image dimensions are large. And to verify that our method is able to correctly learn the Bayesian posterior, we create this compressed sensing toy problem where we applied a compressed sensing matrix, which reduces the dimension by half with Gaussian noise. So you have a Gaussian likelihood. And we handcrafted this Gaussian prior from using all number 3 digits in the MNIST data set. This will give us a Gaussian posterior, which can be analytically computed. So what we did is we compared the posterior estimated by our method to the true posterior, and we see that they matches nicely on both the mean and standard deviation. And we also took a look at the pixel histogram and verified that it matches nicely with the per pixel brightness probability densities. And to further verify this claim on high resolution posterior, we picked this Fourier phase retrieval problem where you only measure the Fourier amplitude. So that means if you lose, you're losing phase information in Fourier space, and that will lead to a bimodal posterior where an upright and rotated image will feature measurements equally well. So ideally, your method should give you a bimodal posterior of an upright image and a rotated image. And that is what we observed with our method, circled in purple, as well as some diffusion samplers shown in blue and green. So here I picked DAPS and DPS. And I do want to mention that for CF-NeRF, which is the method that uses this pixelating, very extreme pixelating decomposition and constrains the posterior on a one-dimensional manifold, it is unable to model a bimodal posterior, and we observe a mode collapse here. So we further take these three methods that gives us a bimodal posterior, and we only give them limited time, for example, 60 minutes. So in this time, our method is able to complete the training and generate 10K posterior samples, and that gave us a very nice bimodal posterior in both the top t-SNE visualization and in the bottom pixel histogram. And in contrast, these diffusion samplers can only give you about 500 posterior samples, and we get those very noisy histograms that I've shown before. However, if you give all the methods unlimited time and let them generate 10K posterior samples, all the methods will give you this very, very nice bimodal posterior, but note that these diffusion samplers will take about more than 5 hours to do this. And one weakness I do want to flag out about our method is that we tend to estimate very narrow distributions, as you can see here. So our distributions are very narrow. That means we're very confident on our reconstructions. Although if you zoom in really closer, you can see our mean is actually slightly off the true values shown by these vertical dashed lines. But with this, we believe that for these inverse problems, scientific inverse problem with large data volume, our method is able to allow you to do this very fast acceleration. So that means you can run our method, get this high resolution posterior very fastly, and then you can identify those objects where there might be interesting science, and then further deploy this like higher fidelity but much more expensive methods for better accuracy. For example, diffusion sampling methods. And with that, I would like to stop here and thank all my collaborators in this project. And I do want to mention that we're also presenting a poster at number 37 today, so please feel free to chat with us, and I'm happy to take questions.